absolutely crucial. These actors bring indispensable knowledge, lived experience, and credibility. They understand the local context, cultural dynamics, and social norms in ways that external actors like us cannot fully grasp. Listening to and working with them is not optional. It is fundamental to designing policies and programs that are both effective and sustainable. Evidence-based insights, such as those provided by Afrobarometer, play a vital role in informing our actions and holding us accountable. Ultimately, advancing gender equality requires more than incremental change. It requires transforming discriminatory social norms and reforming laws that perpetuate inequality. It means challenging deeply embedded structures and shifting power relations within households, communities, institutions, and societies at large. This is not an easy or quick process, but it is necessary if we are to achieve lasting and meaningful progress. With that, I would like to thank you all for your attention and engagement. I wish everyone a stimulating and insightful panel discussion with rich exchanges and valuable takeaways for our shared work ahead. May this exchange be helpful to bridge the gap between commitments and implementation, encouraging practical steps towards meaningful change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Azani, for grounding us in the broader policy landscape. My favorite quote was that backlash is a sign that gender equality is a powerful movement. Very, very amazing, powerful line. Thank you. Following Azani is going to be Juliet Lechner, who will provide us an overview of the E14 network. Welcome, Juliet.
Thank you so much, Rutendo. I'll kindly ask Shannon if she can share the couple of slides I brought in today. I'm very happy to be with you all today. And many thanks to Afrobarometer for organizing such a relevant and timely webinar. Let me see if the slides can be up, otherwise I can share them myself. There we go. Thank you so much, Shannon. I'm just here to say a few words about the Economists for Transformation. This is a Think Africa Partnership initiative. Maybe next slide. The Think Africa Partnership is a World Bank initiative to promote growth and transformation across the region, where we promote evidence-based research and policy uptake. I will share all the links in the chat, and I'll invite you to explore the initiative. But specifically, I wanted to talk to you today about the Economists for Transformation. I think that for many participants joining us today, this is a very relevant network where we have over 700 of your peers from various mentorship and research program and fellowship programs, exchanging knowledge, opportunities, learning from each other's careers, and seeing really how one can guide their own career throughout this quite often difficult environment. So it's a network that most likely mostly takes place on LinkedIn, with also a closed group where you can have very frank and open discussion, and we'll share the link as well. Maybe next slide. I'm just showing here the QR code if you want to join directly, but I invite you all to join, for I'm sure many of you are already members, and I wish you all a very good webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Juliet, for the lovely presentation and insights into the E14 network. The link will be shared in the chat, and I hope so many of you will subscribe and like the LinkedIn page for more incredible insights on their work. It gives me great pleasure to slide back into the next part of our program. As you know, today's webinar is on women's rights and gender equality. It is from this perspective that we see large gender gaps persisting in education, persisting across major barriers to work, and in strong public support for women leaders. And so it gives me great honor to have a conversation with Afrobarometer's board chair, Amina Ayagbola, who will be answering some of the questions that I have for her, and that I'll also be learning as much as you are also learning. Welcome, Amina.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me, Rutenda. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm actually fangirling a little bit at the moment. So bright smiles, bright smiles. So your career spans law, corporate leadership, and long-standing work on women's empowerment. Looking back, what key moments or decisions most shaped your leadership journey and your commitment to expanding opportunities to women?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think there are several moments along my career journey that shaped that. I mean, especially during my child rearing years when the structures did not enable or support me in any way, and that was when I almost actually fell out. Gave up work. I almost gave up work, which was what informed the thinking around the importance of mentorship and support networks for women, because it just simply did not exist. The structures were not there. There was no sort of social or cultural support. The nuance at the time was really around, if you want to work, then work. No excuses. If you want to have a baby, but don't come and complain. You've got a job and get on with the job. So there were no support systems at all. There were no creches. There was no consideration for early closure and stuff like that. And if you had young children at that time and they were falling ill, it became a real challenge. And as I say, the only reason why I remained in corporate life was because I was blessed to have sisters, and my mother was alive, and they essentially formed my support network. And that's why I think, the work that Afrobarometer does, in terms of the state of women's rights and gender equality is actually so crucial and so important, because it shows you the data. It makes it clear that this is African women's lived experience every day. It shows the gaps. It talks about the lack of interest. It shows very clearly that it isn't a question of a lack of interest or lack of competency and capability by African women, but it shows that what we're witnessing in terms of the data is a deep structural challenge, cultural issues, and economic constraints and barriers that continue to hold women back. And a key aspect of the data that comes out very clearly from the Afrobarometer Insight Report 2025 is really around the unequal cost of participation by women. So that's where you'll find that in corporate life, you see at the entry point, that the numbers of women and men are almost equal. But by the time you get to the top, there's probably one woman standing because she simply did not get the support and the structures did not enable her.
Dans les postes de direction, ils n'ont pas d'appui, il n'y a pas d'appui pour ces femmes. Donc, le mentorat, les réseaux d'appui
from our male counterparts is absolutely critical and fundamental.
Ces réseaux ont beaucoup aidé les hommes, donc je pense que ça doit aussi nous aider aussi. Et je pense qu'aujourd'hui, j'ai des superviseurs qui sont des hommes qui ont certaines considérations et qui ont ouvert des portes pour moi pour progresser. Il y a des hommes qui ont vu mon talent, qui ont vu mon talent, qui ont vu ma qualité professionnelle, que je n'ai qualité professionnelle que moi-même je ne voyais pas en moi. Et ce sont ces personnes qui m'ont recommandé, même dans d'autres bureaux dans lesquels j'étais, d'autres réunions dans lesquelles je n'étais même pas présent, ils m'ont recommandé. Donc l'idée générale est que les femmes et les hommes doivent être prêts pour partager le pouvoir et diriger l'inclusion. Et d'une manière générale, reconnaître la valeur que ceci apportera en incluant les femmes et promouvoir les femmes pour qu'ils puissent avancer est très important.
I think those are some very incredible perspectives. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned is the multidimensional nature of gender inequality and the unequal cost of participation. We are already seeing a lot of research showing.
Sorry, Rutindo.
I'm sorry,
Rutindo,
I'm hearing.
can we pause?
Yes,
sorry,
there's a lot of
can we just
interference.
pause? Yeah, the interpretation seems to be coming through. So can we just stop interpretation until we sort this out? And please continue with your conversation.
Rutindo, you can keep going while we sort this out.
Okay, awesome. So as I was saying, the technology is as eager as we are in this conversation. I'm extremely joyful for it. The unequal cost of participation and the multidimensional nature that, of gender inequality is such an important point that you're raising. I think it really shows the depth of the situation and the issues ahead of us when it comes to gender inequality, and perhaps also answer some of the questions on people asking, why aren't we seeing changes as fast as we would want? And I guess that takes me to the next question that I have, which is in all the decades that you've been in this work, you've witnessed Africa's gender equality journey. What developments have you found most encouraging, and where do you see the greatest?
Well, I think that the laws, one thing that we're fortunate to have is sorry, I'm not hearing you very well at the moment.
Okay. So as I was saying,
I can't hear you very well. I didn't hear what you said.
Sure. What developments have you found most encouraging, and where do you still see the greatest cause for concern in Africa's gender equality journey?
Well, I think that what I find most encouraging, in fact, is that, look, all the laws that we need in terms of protecting women's rights actually exist. What we need now is the implementation and policies that will drive the implementation for the advancement of women is what does not exist. So you find that I'm happy that in terms of the progression that we're now in a space where the awareness is there. The debate is no longer, can women lead? The debate is no longer, do women have capability and the competencies and the skills? The issue is ensuring that with intentionality, the spaces are created and the vacancies and the opportunities are created for women, to be included. Because, over decades and decades and decades, several structures have been built around and designed around men. And, it's not, people don't give up power easily. So the issue really is trying to ensure that, the right mandates, the right agendas, clear mandates, clear agendas, clear policies are put in place that will ensure two things. Ensure that, number one, the women are supported and enabled to take up positions when they come up. And that secondly, that the women themselves desire, to participate. I think that desire is there. But the issue is whether the pathway, is one that will enable women, to seize the opportunities that exist. And I'm talking here both about the private sector and the public sector. The situation is, of course, a lot more difficult and more challenging in the public sector, where the issues of financial resources, the issues of, timing of political meetings, which tend to happen late at night, the issues of, the perception, the stigma around sexual harassment and intimidation exists. So even if you have a supportive partner who would ordinarily support you to want to take up a political appointment, when he thinks about the possibility of you being sexually harassed, you are discouraged to do that. If the meetings are going to be held at midnight, which respectable woman wants to be found, going out of her house to go for a political meeting at midnight? But so that's on the one side. And then there's the issue of, access to capital. Women have been marginalized for so long. So we have to deliberately ensure that there's some kind of mobilization to put funding in place to support females, women who are interested in taking up political positions. In my country, for example, in Nigeria, the statistics are really, really poor. Nigeria is lagging behind. I think the statistics in terms of the gender inequality index were 167 over 191. We're at 5%, less than 5% representation in a National Assembly in our parliament. So out of 109 senators, there are only 4 female senators in the National Assembly. And, there's the celebrated matter of Natasha Akpoti, who, was a sitting senator, and all the challenges that she has since been grappling with, since she assumed office. So, and even at the executive leadership, in government, we seem to be receding, from a situation where we had 18 appointees. Now there are only 9 women in our cabinet, in executive cabinet. So the issues are real. It's not just, we don't want just the rhetoric, to say, oh, we believe in inclusion, we're driving inclusion. I think the research and the data is there, which makes it very, very clear that it's smart economics to include women. It's going to drive development. It's going to drive innovation. It's going to enable the country to grow. And at the end of the day, the prosperity is going to be shared. But the issue is the how. The men are in charge. They're the ones with the deep pockets. Women don't have those deep pockets. Women don't own banks. You have women today who are the top of, financial institutions in my environment. And we're pleased to see that change and that transformation. But how did that transformation happen? It happened because a male central bank governor, in the person of, Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, took a decision, a deliberate decision, an intentional decision at a certain point in time to say, he mandated that all financial institutions should have 30% female representation. And then several years, more than 10 years now down the line, we see so many female CEOs, at the top of financial institutions, contributing their quota, enhancing the revenues of those financial institutions, contributing significantly to the prosperity of the Nigerian capital market, the Nigerian exchange, due to the fantastic performance that they're reporting. So the value that women can bring is very, very, very clear. The issue is how many other sectors have decided to adopt that. I'm privileged as founder of also WISCA, Women in Successful Careers, to be part of a female coalition. We've decided to pull together as women to support us, to support each other, and to try and advance certain key things that we think are important. One is labor reform around maternity and paternity leave. And, one other female organization has now joined our movement around what they call unpaid care work and the whole care economy, which is essential and is also a recognition of who we are as women, that we have a responsibility, we have a civic duty to procreate and to have children. And that does not mean that our careers should come to an end. During that phase of our careers, what support structures need to be put in place by institutions? And if I come back into the corporate institutions, at the end of the day, the CEOs of various corporations can actually mandate to say, look, I'm driving a gender agenda. I'm putting in place a mentorship and a sponsorship framework to support our female talent, and also ensure that in the process, the male colleagues are properly educated so that they don't feel excluded. Don't begin to feel like, it's either or. They need to get involved and become allies and partners in progress to ensure that women are included, for the shared prosperity, and to know that the pie is actually bigger and that more cakes can actually be baked if you include women.
I think those are some seriously amazing takeaways, Amina. I think in terms of even just looking at a more equal future for the continent, I would say, one of the things you've raised is the fact that the laws are available, but the implementation is critical. And that the debate is no longer about capability because the spaces are available, but now it's providing the financial structures, the socioeconomic and the cultural structures that need to be. And, one of my favorite aspects of what you said is, at least looking into the future, is that the education and the engagement of men so that they're also part of this conversation and also part of being partners in progress is quite vital, especially to break down these structures. I think I've learned so much, and there's still so much more to learn, but unfortunately we've got to move along. But I just want to thank you so much for giving us this time and these crucial, wise insights. Thank you so much, Amina.
Thank you so much, Rutinda. Thank you for having me.
All right. Of course, I'm still fangirling from Amina and just having a wonderful conversation with her. And you all got to be a part of it. And so now we come to the findings that Amina was referring to, which is the round 10 survey findings by Afrobarometer. And with this, I would like to invite Josephine Appiah Sani to come and present these findings for us and ground Amina's insights for the rest of the conversation. Welcome, Josephine.
Hi, Rotendo. Hi, everyone. Okay, thank you, Rotendo. So I'm going to be sharing our latest findings from our 10th round of surveys that were conducted between 2024 and 2025. So we're going to look at some of the findings on gender equality and women's rights. But before we get into that, let me just take a moment to introduce those of you who don't know about Afrobarometer, to who we are and what we do. Afrobarometer is basically a Pan-African non-partisan survey network. And what we do is to provide reliable data on Africans' experiences, their evaluations of democracy, governance, and basically everything that affects the quality of the lives of the ordinary African. Why do we do this? We do this so that when policies are being made, the voices, the expectations, and experiences of the ordinary African will reflect in these policies. We've been doing this since 1999, and we've conducted about 10 rounds of surveys so far. Our most recent round of survey and the findings from which I'm going to be sharing was conducted in 38 African countries. But in total, as of July 2025, we had conducted surveys in about 45 African countries. The next slide will show you a map of where our footprints are. So as I mentioned earlier, we started in 1999 in 12 countries, and over the years, we have grown our footprints to about 45 countries. The areas shaded gray are basically where we've not been able to conduct surveys yet, and it's usually due to a host of reasons. It could be the political situation or the unavailability of reliable census data or other reasons, but we are still gradually expanding our footprints to other countries. Now our data covers about 3/4 of the voices of Africans. Our surveys are nationally representative, and we use sample of adult citizens who are aged 18 years and above. Our interviews are face-to-face, and they are administered in the language of the respondent's choice. We also have a standard questionnaire, which allows us to, compare the findings across countries and over time, and you'll be seeing quite a lot of that today. Our sample sizes are usually 1,200 to 2,400 adult citizens, and it yields a margin of error of either +or-2 or +or-3. Now let's dig into the findings. I'm going to be showing you a few gaps, and then we'll also look at some realities. And so we'll start with the gaps in educational attainments. Now, when you look at the first two bars on the left, we're showing the level of educational attainment for all men and all women. Of course, the sample is those age 18 and above. And we asked them what their highest level of education is. We see here, when you look at the first two bars, that there's quite a lot of gender disparity. And so men are more likely than women to have secondary or post-secondary education. And women are more likely than men to lack formal education altogether. But now let's look at the set of bars in the middle. We went down to break down, the levels of education for women according to the rural-urban divide. And it shows here that the rural woman is more disadvantaged than the urban woman. If you look at the orange, the area shaded orange, which shows those who have no formal education at all, you see here that rural women are more than twice as likely as the urban women to lack formal education. And it's a similar trend when you look up there, the two deep blues. So if you measure those who have either secondary or post-secondary education, and you compare the rural women to the urban women, you realize that the rural women are, you know, the urban woman is twice as likely as the rural woman to have secondary or post-secondary education. There's a bit of good news when you look at the 4 sets of bars on the right. If you look at the generational gap, then you realize that younger women, those aged 18 to 35 years, are more likely to have secondary or post-secondary education compared to the older generation. Next slide, please. Now, in the next slide, we are looking at the trends in educational attainment, and we are looking at 26 countries that were surveyed between 2011 to 2025. Now, the good news here is that there's been an increase. So if you look at the purple bar, there's been an increase in the proportion of women. And here we're only looking at those with post-secondary or secondary education. And there's been an increase in the proportion of women who have secondary or post-secondary education. The not so good news is that the gender gaps persist. And so women consistently trail the men when it comes to educational attainment. In the next slide, we're going to take a deeper look at the gaps in the lack of formal education and achievements of post-secondary education. And, you know, the previous slides I shared sort of marks the gaps because we're showing the continental averages. So we decided to break it down according to country. So on our left, the orange bars, we are looking at the likelihood that women have, you know, are more likely to lack formal education. And so if you look at the bars here, the positives, so it's the difference between the women and the men, the proportion of women, the proportion of men who lack formal education. And so the positive figures show that more women lack formal education, and the negative figures show that more men lack formal education compared to women. And so you see on the bar that in about 25 or more countries, actually 27 countries, more women than men lack formal education. And I mean, the gap is as high as 22 percentage points in Guinea, 18 percentage points in Benin, 16 percentage points in Comoros, etc. Lesotho is actually the only country out of the 38 countries that we've surveyed that shows that men are more likely than women to lack formal education. On the right, we're looking at achievements of post-secondary education, and it's the same. So if it's positive, it means that there are more women who have post-secondary education than men. And if it's negative, it means that there are more men who have post-secondary education. And you see here that it's only in countries like South Africa, Tunisia, and Seychelles where women are more likely than men to have post-secondary education. For most of the other countries, the women are trailing behind men when it comes to attainment of the highest level of education. Next slide. Now, are girls prevented from going to school? You know, most of the Africans, so about 86% say it is really rare or unheard of for a community, you know, in the community for girls to be prevented from going to school because their families prioritize women education. And so we have only about 13% who say that it happens frequently. But if you look up there, so in countries like Cameroon, Malawi, and Mali, we have more than a quarter or more of the citizens saying that girls are actually prevented from going to school because their parents want to prioritize boy-child education. Almost 3 in 10 of Africans are saying that schoolgirls often or always face discrimination, harassment, or requests for sexual favors from their teachers. And I mean, there are stark variations if you compare the 38 African countries. It reaches as high as 7 in 10 in Gabon. And close to 6 in 10 in Cameroon. But on the other side, in countries like Mauritius and Madagascar and Sierra Leone, Tanzania, we have just about 1 in 10 or even fewer who say this issue happens frequently. Now, we're also going to look at the gender gaps in employment. And we start with the employment status. Here, remember I said that the questions are administered to adults who are 18 years and above. And we see here that African men, so if you compare the greens, the deep green and the light green, you will see that African men are about 13 percentage points more than the women to have paid employment. So either they are employed full-time or they are employed part-time. Now, what I find to be most interesting is the last column on the right. So the light yellow. When you look at the women who are saying they are not employed, but they are not looking for jobs, it's 40%. And then we have 30% of men who are saying they are not employed, but they are not looking for jobs. It means that there's like a 10 percentage gap between the proportion of women who are unemployed but not searching and the proportion of men who are unemployed and not searching. Now, we also asked about barriers to women, entering or even moving up in the workforce. And the type of barrier that was most commonly cited was the fact that employers prefer to hire men rather than women. The second issue was that women lack the necessary education or skills. And then the third was the lack of childcare, followed by the lack of remote or flexible working arrangements. Next slide. Now, we also asked how common it is that women in, the respondents' communities are prevented either by their husbands or relatives from taking paid employment. And on average, we have close to a quarter, that's 23%, of citizens saying that this happens often or always. And it's as high as 4 in 10 in countries like Cameroon, Uganda, and Mali. Again, when you look at the bottom, Mauritius is at the bottom, where just about 2% say that this happens often or always. I think this is probably my favorite slide. We asked citizens if men should have more rights to jobs if jobs are scarce. And on average, we have 4 in 10 Africans saying they agree or strongly agree that in instances where jobs are scarce, men should be prioritized. And I mean, in countries like Mauritania and Madagascar, we have about 7 in 10 citizens supporting this view that men should be prioritized when jobs are scarce. But on the other side, we have about 8 in 10 citizens in Cabo Verde, Seychelles, and Botswana who say they disagree with this view. They disagree or strongly disagree with this view. So to them, women should be given the same rights as men, even to jobs, even when the jobs are scarce. Now let's look at this, let's break down this view, according to the various social demographic groups. And let's look at those who disagree with this view. So of course, women, urban citizens, well-educated citizens, and then the economically well-off citizens are more likely to disagree with this view compared to the other counterparts. Now let's move on to the gaps, the gender gaps in leadership and political participation. One question we also asked, so we asked respondents to choose between 2 statements. The first statement is that men make better political leaders than women and should be elected rather than women. And the second statement says that women should have the same chance of being elected to political office as men. On average, across Africa, we have about 3/4 of the citizens saying that women should have the same chance of being elected to political office as men. But there's also another quarter of Africans who think that men make better political leaders than women. And if you look at this, if you break it down according to the countries, again, there's Seychelles, Cabo Verde, and Botswana up there saying that women should have equal chance. But at the other side, we have countries like Nigeria, where the citizens are almost evenly split. So we have 50% saying that women should have equal chance, but another 40%, which is half, also saying that men make better leaders. Now, if you look at these views, according to demographic groups, again, we have more women, more people in the urban areas, more educated people, and the economically well-off supporting this view that women should have equal chance of being elected as men. Now, we also looked at the changes in the support for equal chance for women to be elected. And so this shows that the percentage, the changes over time over the past decade. So between 2014 and 15 to 2025 and 2024 and 25. And the green bars show where there's been like improvements, so increases in the support for women to be given equal chance to be elected. And I mean, it looks quite impressive. And it's as high as 21 percentage points in Malawi, 15 percentage points in Tunisia, 15 percentage points in Lesotho, etc. But if you look down there in Togo, Namibia, and Mozambique, there's actually been a significant decline in the support for women in political leadership. We're also going to look at political participation, and I'd invite all of you to read our flagship reports on participation, citizen engagement. And one of the key findings that we saw there is that women lag behind men when it comes to all the key forms of political participation. So when it comes to voting, when it comes to political party affiliation, joining others to, request action from governments, joining demonstrations, or even posting about politics or discussing politics on social media. They are also less likely, than men to contact political party officials, contact members of parliament, or contact the media, to share their views about issues that they are not happy about. Next slide. So let's move on to asset ownership and financial decision-making. Here, when it comes to asset ownership, we also see significant gaps. So, I mean, women are less likely than men to own mobile phones. They are less likely to own mobile money accounts, to own bank accounts, to own a vehicle or a car. And that's actually where we see the steepest gap. So there's like a 19% gap between men and women when it comes to ownership of vehicles and cars. And then the next biggest gap would be in the ownership of bank accounts, which is like a 10% gap, followed by ownership of mobile money accounts. Also, when it comes to the use connectivity, so when it comes to the proportion who use internet either a few times in a week or every day, or those who use mobile phones a few times in a week or every day, or those who actually own smartphones, it means that their mobile phones have access to internet. Again, we see consistent gaps here. Now here we ask the respondents, so the question is, what is the main way that decisions are made about how to use any money that you have earned? So the financial decision-making power, the monies that they've earned, who decides how the money is used? And on the left, we have the answers for the men. On the right, we have the answers for the women. And we see here that the men are more likely to say that they decide themselves, whereas the women are about twice as likely as the men to say that that decision is made by their spouse. Next slide. Now let's also look at sexual harassment in public places. We have about a quarter of citizens saying that women are always or often sexually harassed in public places. And it's as high as 6 in 10 in countries like Gabon and Guinea-Bissau. But it's quite low in Sierra Leone and Mauritius. Mauritius, again, looks like Mauritius is doing something good. Next slide. Now, how likely it is that women and girls will be believed if they complain of discrimination or harassment? We have about 2/3 of citizens saying that it's very likely or somewhat likely that they will be believed when they report issues of discrimination or harassment. That is good. And it's really high in countries like Malawi, Tunisia, and Uganda. But at the bottom, we have just fewer than 4 in 10 in a country like Chad, and just fewer than half in Namibia and Gambia. Are the police and courts doing enough to protect women and girls? Well, we have about three-quarters of citizens, or even 8 in 10, saying that they need to do much more, or they need to do somewhat more. It means that they are not, just about 2 in 10 are saying that the police and courts are doing enough to protect women and girls. And the proportion who say that they need to do more is a majority view in all the 38 countries that we surveyed. Thank you very much. We'll be releasing 2 reports on gender equality, so I'll just encourage all of you to look out for our latest reports. We'll be sharing them widely when it comes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josephine. That was Josephine Sani, Afrobarometer Communications Director, was presenting the latest gender findings. We really appreciate it. I was had a whole moment on seeing that in over 25 countries, more women led formal education, and that 4 in 10 Africans agree that men are to be prioritized when there's less jobs. And of course, as Amina has mentioned, we need greater political participation amongst women, and obviously systems of change need to happen. So thank you so much, Josephine, for presenting those findings. Please be on the lookout for the reports Josephine has referred to that will be released, so that you can also implement them within your own systems of change. Thank you so much. So now we will open up the floor to a discussion with very distinguished guests that I am very much looking forward to having a conversation with today. So it will be in the format of a panel discussion, and we'll have ourselves 4 speakers who come to speak to us from the political perspective, advocacy perspective, economic perspective, to really ground the results that have been shared by Josephine with us today. So allow me the pleasure of introducing Nozipho January Bardil, Afrobarometer board member, who will be one of our speakers today. Welcome, Nozipho. And then we'll also have Faizat Badmouz Buzari, the Regional Program Manager at Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, the SIHA Network. Welcome, Faizat.
Thank you. Hi.
We also have Theophilene Bose-Duka, Senior Economist at the Africa Center for Economic Transformation. Welcome, Theophilene.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hello. And lastly, we have Dominique Mpoel, Resource Mobilization Officer at the Pan-African Parliament. Welcome, Dominique. As you can all see, we are joined by a very distinguished panel. I don't even know where to begin. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us and helping us to ground these conversations. I guess as a first start, I just want to open a question to all of you, to get your responses, firstly, in terms of just the results and to draw on your various experiences. As we've noticed from the findings that Josephine has shared, women continue to face barriers to paid work, from employer bias to care burdens to limited asset ownership. So what reforms would you say are most critical for unlocking women's economic participation? And here I just want to open by starting with Theophilene, and then we'll go around the room.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lutendo, and thank you to all the distinguished speakers who have come before me. I bring greetings from Asset. We love Afrobarometer, we love TAP, we love E4T. So this is really, really good. Thank you so much for inviting me. So Shannon, could you please share my slide? I do have one slide that would most likely not be surprising to most people. So what Afrobarometer's data is showing is that there is a gap between the law and people's lived realities, right? And we find the same thing in our latest African Women's Inclusion Report. So just to give a bit of context, the AWI, which we call it, that's the short name, right? The AWI is an index that we have created to try to track AU's second African Women's Decade. Now, this decade was signed on by African leaders to ensure that between 2020 and 2030, women's financial and economic inclusion is improved greatly. So this is just a way of keeping us accountable. So, and you can already tell what the story is saying, right? So these numbers you are seeing on the 4 slabs are the continent's average scores across the 4 dimensions of the index. So you can see that countries score relatively high on law and legal structures. We are about 3/4 of the way there, but much lower on leadership, financial inclusion, and economic inclusion, which are all in, 40s and very low 50s. So we are just about halfway there with the other dimensions. So the data clearly tell a very, very stark story in a sense. So we have made progress on laws, but the progress is not translating into real economic outcomes for women. And from a macroeconomic perspective, this gap persists because, broadly speaking, and Amina touched on this quite a bit, gender equality is not really embedded in the structure of our economic institutions and our economics at large. Labor markets remain segmented, women are still concentrated in lower productivity and informal work, and paid care burdens are still super high on women, and access to assets and finance, just like Josephine just showed us, remains unequal. So even when we have these laws, the broader system continues to reproduce inequality by default. This is why, to move from commitments to reality, we need very intentional economic policies. And this may, I always say this, that for a long time, our economic policymaking process treats gender as a peripheral issue, like this is the social issue, it doesn't really connect to economics, but they are so connected. They are 2 sides of the same coin. And in practice, this might mean that we switch, like we might have to make radical changes, right? It might mean that we have to switch from having this one big ministry that combines gender, youth, and other social issues, and in most cases, these ministries are very low funded. And perhaps move towards really integrating gender and gender issues into the core economic ministries, like finance, like trade, like manufacturing, right? Like economic planning. We don't need a separate gender ministry. We need gender within all these ministries. And you wonder why I think we need to take such drastic measures, maybe. But I think that even though we are making progress, clearly progress is too slow. And at the current pace, it will take us until 2093 to achieve full financial and economic inclusion for women across Africa. That's 67 years from today, I believe. And I think that's a very sobering statistic, and we need to take radical measures if we want to see this change. I'll stop here and, add more once that we go around again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Theophilene. I mean, those are some sobering statistics, but I think one of the, my favorite things that you said was we need to integrate, the gender lens in core economic ministries and have it embedded at all measures of planning. But of course, some of these things are made difficult by situations such as conflict. And so in thinking through unlocking women's economic participation, I would love to know from Dominique, I'd love to know from Faizad, what additional economic barriers women face in conflict and post-conflict settings.
Thanks, Rutendo, and also, Theophilus for that grounding. I think, when we look at it from the conflict settings, and particularly looking at the findings from this morning, I kept on trying to look at the countries that were popping up, and I was hoping to see a lot more from the Horn of Africa, where the countries where I'm working, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Uganda. There's some of them were there, but these are conflict and post-conflict settings. And unfortunately, the reality even goes beyond what we've seen from the findings this morning. Because with conflict, it doesn't actually create the inequality. It weaponizes it and amplifies the already existing inequalities that we are seeing. So in terms of what it looks like, conflict turns, the already inequalities we've seen in the disparities in the education. We saw it even in terms of social norms and what people think in terms of whether women should or men, should have the opportunity. We've seen it turning into tools of control, and already as Theophilus talked about, the having systems in place in this situation in terms of conflict, the systems collapse. So there's nothing to access. There's no financial regulatory bodies. There is no ministry of gender. In fact, in some of the countries, we're struggling. We have Somalia, which recently renamed the Ministry of Gender to Ministry of Human Services. So we see backlash and backsliding happening, compounding the situation more. So I think from my context, I would say that what is compounding these issues, I'll just mention 3 aside from the many that we're seeing in everyday conflicts. Today is next month actually marks 3 years of the conflict in Sudan, April 15, 2023. So that's 3 years of girls not being in school. That is 3 years of women losing their livelihood. That is 3 years of internally displaced camps being filled up. Since the conflict started, I see ourselves, we've documented over 1,294 cases of sexual violence. What we've seen as something that is expounding the fact women's leadership agency and all the issues we've talked about this morning is also the fact that sexual violence is used as a weapon of war. It's used to create fear, intimidation, stopping women from, because, there's no room for healing. We're trying to support healing and all of that. So I've seen within the conflict, I would say, it strips women their protection. It restricts women's agency and choice. It restricts women's agency and choices. We've seen that in so many ways during the conflict as well. We've seen that, for example, in South Sudan, we managed the only one-stop center. We've seen that 78% of the rape cases, all 569 survivors that we had in the center received legal aid. But out of the 569, we had only 99 agreed to pursue access to justice, to go to court or any form of mediation. But the thing is that at the end of the day, out of the 99, there was only 68 convictions. So how do you trust in a system that fails you? How do you trust in we also had, I think, 10 cases that were settled from traditional courts, which also prioritizes traditional rulings. Their families settling out of court, agreeing because of honoring the family. So how do you trust systems that are already designed to fail you from the beginning? The last point I'll mention is that also we've seen that during the conflict, before we can even think about economic participation, leadership, and all of that, we see that it also reshapes the role of women. So it increases their responsibility without increasing their power. A lot of women, when they were fleeing from one area to the other during the conflict, they told us they left with only their clothing on, but with their children or their parents or their family. But the men fled immediately. Just the first bomb blast, they're out. But women had that additional care burden of thinking about how do I get the whole family away from this location to a new location. But what we've also seen in terms of strengths, and I really want to highlight this, is that, and I say this in every engagement that I am in, the resilience, and I hate to use that word because now women are expected to automatically be resilient, but the resilience that I have seen, they coming up with organizing community kitchens, supporting the sexual violence victims, ensuring that they are, the community trusts them. So seeing them taking on leadership roles still without that power and agency that is required, I think is one of the most important things that we've learned from this. So the lesson I would say from SIHA would be that if we're serious about strengthening women's rights and leadership especially within context like conflict, we must stop designing solutions for women and start resourcing what already exists on the ground, because they are also already taking up that power and spaces by themselves. I'll pause here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faizat. I think more than the audience, I am learning more than anyone in the audience. I'm going to be very selfish about that. I think one of the important points that you've raised is that, resilience is much, we're not saying it in a negative way that I'll just, suck it up and be resilient, but it has essentially become the engine of women growing in leadership in difficult circumstances. And that conflict also amplifies and weaponizes existing structures. And I think this is where I'll just, want to bring in Nozipho and subsequently Dominique into the conversation is, what Theophilus and what Faizat have raised are these deep structural issues that are raised from a socio-cultural perspective. And, one of the things Faizat said, how can we trust a system that is already designed to fail you from the beginning? So with that said, Nozipho, what structural changes help institutions become genuinely gender transformative rather than gender blind?
Well, thank you very much to everybody and for the inputs that so far we've had. And I think that is actually where the crux of our struggles lies, in structural and systemic issues that I think we all experience, of women who are both professionals, but also women who are mothers and grandmothers, and aunts and uncles in the social sphere, in our families and in our communities. And I think one of the things that we struggle with a lot is that we say that men must be part of solving the problem, because in a sense, they are the ones that are, through patriarchy, the beneficiaries of the inequality that we see between men and women, but they also play a big role in running our institutions. And so how can we expect them, therefore, to change the situation when they're benefiting from it? And in South Africa, I can make the same distinction sort of in a kind of a race way, where white South Africans are not going to give up power in the institutions in which they are, particularly in our economy, in order for us to necessarily have access. And so there is a definite deficit in discussing the issues that, we have to organize also from the bottom up. Somebody once said, one of our judges during our own struggle, that human rights it's not going to be given to any one of us on a platter. We have to struggle for our rights. So that's one thing I would say. And a lot of women are very much involved in economic struggles here at home, besides social and cultural struggles. So I'll just give you one example. More recently, as part of our national strategy to end gender-based violence, the government created a 6-pillar strategy. The first one was on accountability. The second one was on prevention and social cohesion. The third one is on legal rights legal remedies to sexual harassment and GBV. The fourth one is support care and psychosocial care. And the fifth one is economic empowerment. And women got together and said, okay, how are we going to deal with the economic empowerment one? Because we all need jobs, we need to create a living, we need to own our own businesses to make a difference, we need to have access to finance. And they've organized themselves into a women's economic assembly. And those of us sitting on boards of various companies literally used our agency to go to the board and say, okay, Mercedes-Benz, how can you enable us in the motor car industry to have more women have access to owning dealerships? And we went to the professional bodies and went to the whole industry to say it's about time that these dealerships are shared amongst women. And through that process, there are 30 dealerships that are now being prepared for women to own and for women to run and to have access to. And so that struggle from the bottom, I think, is very, very important and one we can't underestimate. I think we need to make a distinction between women's rights and women power and gender power relations. And I think because it's also the 30th year of Beijing, I think that came through in the Beijing Platform for Action, the distinction between women's rights and gender equality, or rather gender power relations. Our rights are embedded in our constitution, and there's no doubt about it in most of our countries that have constitutions. Those constitutions we also have legislation, and if you look around, and that relates to one of the questions I was asked, many of our countries have got very progressive legislation, and the deep, deep problem is implementation of that legislative framework. And I think the reason why the implementation is poor is really that the primary institutions are not really paying much attention to gender equality. As was said here, the mainstreaming of gender into certainly the executive system is not very good. And once again, we tried through something we call the women's budget right earlier on after 1994, after freedom in South Africa. We did a women's budget to try and get all government departments to, if you like, genderize the budget and make sure that the fiscus is spread in such a way that it actually made provisions for women to have access to finances at all levels, including in the private sector. Procurement is very high in government. If you think about all the procurement that government does, there's a lot of room for women to be included in those procurement practices. But also, women have a right to a job. It's not a favor for women to be given jobs. They have rights according to constitutions, according to United Nations conventions that many of our governments have signed and ratified. And therefore, the right to jobs should not really be a problem. The issue is once you have access to the job, there are other factors then come into play, the cultures that often are very male-dominated. The cultures are structured in such a way that women's opportunity to grow within where they are often limited. A few of us trickle to the top, that is very true, but a lot of them really struggle if you are not able to use your own agency to get to where you want to go. And so we see that whilst we have rights, the rights only give us an opportunity to make a claim that something has happened, but they're not going to change or transform our experience in the workplace or our access to better pay in our workplace. So I think that from my own experience of doing transformative work in the companies and in the institutions I've worked in, it's really just about using agency and understanding the difference between maintaining your status quo, reforming and transforming. I think those are very, very different. And often when they reform is often mistaken for transformation, whereas you've just literally moved the tables around the chairs around the same table. And I think things like, to what extent is everybody who's in management, if you have gender equality laws in your companies and in your government institutions, is everybody going to be measured against that index? In other words, men and women, are they going to measure it when you do performance measurement? You say, okay, in my department, how many cases of sexual harassment have I had in my department? And how does that affect my bonus at the end of the year? How many people have I actually employed? How many women have I employed? And going to be counted when I am assessed by my manager to see that I've made a difference. And I think those where people really feel the effects of either implementing or not implementing. But while there's no accountability and people can get away with doing nothing and still get huge salaries at the end of the month, it's not really going to pay off. So I'm really saying different levels of understanding. I use the feminist perspective in my work on gender equality unapologetically, because it does deal with the structural and the systemic issues that we face. I think I'll stop there for now. I don't know if I've answered the question.
No, you've absolutely answered the question. I think, there's so many quotes. If we were to create quotes about you on the internet, there's so many I can take from here. I think the most important one that I really want to raise here is, go where the money is. Once you create a financial economic incentive around real transformation, reform, and not maintaining the status quo, we actually start to see some changes. And I think, it also speaks to the issue around the fiscus, right? Where can we distribute equitably the resources of the country to provide for greater gender equality? And I think the second thing you've raised that's very important is a difference between rights as well as equality. I think that's a very important distinction if we were to ever take anything away from today. Is the fact that we as Josephine mentioned, we do have the laws in place. We do have, the constitutional protections in place, but are we seeing it at a cultural level in the design of the very systems meant to protect and erase some of these inequalities? I think that's something that's important for us to take away. So if there's any question around people thinking through their design, how can you expect people to fix something that they're benefiting from? Absolutely remove the benefit for them. Thank you so much for that, Nozipho. We've had several case studies brought here, the Sudan case study, South Africa's case study. And I think it would be very important to understand the continental aspect of it. What we know that there have been progresses made in continental frameworks. And I would really love to bring Dominique into this conversation to help us think through, the continental frameworks that are available that could make these national policies and their implementation a much stronger conversation. Welcome, Dominique, and we are eager for your contribution.
Thank you, Rutendo. Good afternoon, everyone. Really honored to be part of this discussion. What I would like to bring into the conversation today about gender commitments is the work that the Pan-African Parliament is trying to do around gender equality and gender equity. For those who don't know the Pan-African Parliament, it is the legislative organ of the African Union created to ensure full participation of African peoples in the development and integration of the continent. And this creation really reflects Africa's transition toward people-centered continental governance, where elected parliamentarians from all AU member states engage in policy dialogue, oversight, and legislative harmonization on issues affecting African citizens. So while the Pan-African Parliament is still evolving towards full legislative powers, it already plays a key role in promoting governance, human rights, aligning national legislations with continental commitments, which is, I believe, key to the conversation we have been having so far. And one of the main tools the Parliament uses for this is the development of model laws, which serve as a legislative template that member states can then adapt to strengthen their own legal frameworks. As it has been mentioned by Josephine, also by Theophilene, legislations are there and are existing at continental level. There's the Maputo Protocol, there's the AU Gender Equality Strategy, but I think the word that comes across, and I'm quite reassured to see that we all have figured out that implementation is the bottleneck, because those frameworks that are quite strong are available, but are not implemented equally at national levels. So the Parliament engaging in the development of the gender equality and equity model law is a way of trying to address this issue. why gender equality and equity, because this was also a question that was discussed a lot within the consultations when the model law was developed, because as it has also transpired in the data shared by Josephine and throughout the conversation, gender parity is not just about numbers, percentage. Now, yes, there are legislations giving access to 30%, 40%, 50% of female representation, but out of those 30%, 40%, how many of them have access to leadership positions? How many have at the same level equal pay as male colleagues on the same level? These are some of the gaps that the model laws developed by the Pan-African Parliament try to address, providing to member states a model, a template to either, because you have different level of progress in terms of gender parity throughout the member states. And you would be surprised to find out that some of them would just, be mentioning that they don't even know where to start. Yes, there's the Maputo Protocol, but how do they domesticate it? How do they implement it? The Parliament has embarked on this journey to try to address this and, get to legislative harmonization throughout the continent. Of course, the task is not. There are many aspects. We talked about political participation. We talked about economic autonomy. Just at the level of Parliament itself, studies show that at the pace, of course, there has been progress. We have about 24% of female representation globally. But at this pace, we will reach gender parity in parliaments, luckily in 2063. I was also quite because we are, as Ritendo was mentioning, we are all learning. I was quite surprised to find out that economic autonomy parity would be at this, if things are not improved, would be attained only in 2093. But to come back to how institutions like the Pan-African Parliament try to translate representation into real into real influence, I would say, three elements are critical. The first one is access to decision-making spaces, which includes leadership positions within parliamentary committees and political structures. The second one would be effective participation in legislative process, meaning the ability for women to shape laws, not just to occupy seats. Third, of course, the presence of gender responsive legal and policy frameworks that would enable women leaders to translate priorities into concrete reforms. I think it was, I really, the key word I kept from Amina's presentation was intentionality. This is really, the key word that would enable us to translate all this into real influence. I hope I've answered your question, but I'll pause there for now.
Thank you so much, Dominique. I think you've raised important issues. I think it also touches on some of the things that Nozipo are saying in terms of the organization and mobilization of women around issues that specifically affect them. And you've raised the important point that this comes with, increasing the political participation of women, which is critical to having people mobilize more in decision-making spaces. And you know, access is not, it doesn't end at just access just because you have a seat. It's the actual meaningful participation and intentionality in the decision-making process of, you know, changing just the laws and also providing for concrete reforms. And you know, from everything that the speakers have mentioned, you know, the issue of intentionality, implementation, and meaningful participation continues to come up as a key theme. And so, you know, I think this is a nice place to take some questions from our audience. Perhaps there's more learnings that we can get from our audience. So I'm just going to open up the floor to questions from our audience. Please, if you have any questions, you're welcome to drop them in the Q&A. Of course, we have some lovely comments as well. We need more educational conferences about women, African women. We are almost non-existent in the research world, and it is hard to find out about African women. So to our decision makers, this is a very important key takeaway. And of course, there was an incredible point that was raised about also including the boy child in the conversation so that they can understand where the cultural barriers lie. All right. Of course, we have one question here from someone who says that one important aspect about education is that women are the first educator of our children. Do we African women ourselves create our own conditions? How should we come to understand that, that aspect of the development of young women? I don't know if from our speakers, anyone has any response to that?
Yes, thank you. If I may, I think for a long time there was a sense that as women, we were not involving men in these struggles, and increasingly that narrative is changing, and more women are now becoming very convinced that we have to, if we are going to do prevention work, especially across all these areas of social experience, then we need to get boy children also come to, you know, there's this Bring the Girl Child to Work that has been one of the UN days. I think it happens in around November, the Bringing the Girl Child to Work, to also bring the boy child to work and expose them, you know, to that work experience, and but educate them in a way that enables them to learn how they might be feminist men, you know, who in the future can make a difference for themselves, but also for women along whose sides they work. And I'll just take this opportunity to congratulate the African Union also for recently adopting the Convention to End Violence Against Women and Girls. Dominic, apparently only 2 countries so far have ratified the convention. I don't know whether there is a sort of advocacy for the 53 other countries to adopt this convention. Maybe you could just say something about the status of the convention that has recently been adopted. Thank you, Ritendo.
Thanks, Nosipho. Dominic?
Yes, thank you, Nosipho. Thanks, Ritendo. Yes, the convention was, as you mentioned, recently adopted, and there is, of course, a conversation with the Pan-African Parliament and the Women, Gender and Youth Directorate in the African Union Commission, which is championing the adoption of the convention. The next Pan-African Parliament sittings to be held in Midrand will address this not only through the lens of the Gender Committee, but also through the Women Caucus of the Pan-African Parliament, that is a sort of pressure group that really focuses on issues related to women as gender-based violence and the rest. So yes, there are plans that are along the way, and the convention is really integrated into the plans of the Parliament this year. But of course, we have not held our sittings yet, which is why I can, at this stage, only talk about plans. But yes, it is integrated in the activities of the year.
Thank you so much, Dominique. I think keyword the integration at all aspects, all structure levels, is very important. We have a comment/question that I think Theophilus will be very well equipped to respond to here, but anyone jump in as well. From Judith Stella Amalo. In addition to those barriers, is that policies are made but never implemented because there's nobody that is there to implement those policies. And yet women and men don't know each other's rights, so that the law can be put to action, not only by government, but also individuals themselves. I think one of the things you spoke about, Theophilus, was, at structural levels, how are we actually looking at the implementation of these policies? So, should we create radical structures where there's someone they actively monitoring to ensure that it's there? So I'd really love to know what your perspective is on this.
Certainly. So, one of the big problems that we have is the fact that there are not enough women in these positions. So access is still an issue, like most of us have said already. And then, of course, there's actual participation. So, for instance, in the AWI, we do have a measure where we measure like the number of women in parliament, but we also go further to try and measure the number of women in the cabinet, for instance, so that we can see how many women actually have decision-making power, because there's always a distinction, right? The power goes where the money goes. So if you don't have the financial resources, then you are sort of just stuck, no matter how highly placed you are as a woman. So that's definitely very important. I think it really generally still comes back to intentionality. There's just we can't do it just won't happen automatically based on how our structures are, right? So it really does take a certain level of intentionality on everybody's part, governments, parliaments, everyone's part. And the only way to get there, unfortunately, is to change mindsets, right? And changing mindsets is quite a long process. Sometimes it can be. So I really do value what organizations like Afrobarometer does, because it takes the information out there. And even all our organizations, CSOs like Assets, we are becoming a bit more intentional about how we package our research so that it reaches the average African, right? We package it in different packages so that it can reach the government, it can reach the policymakers, but at the same time, it can reach, the CEOs, the private sector, it can reach the average citizen, it can reach people in the informal sector, in the rural community. That step is really important if we want to change mindsets and change our power structure and shared power, right? If we want to achieve shared power, there's a lot that goes into just educating the public about the benefits of because like everyone has said, it's not easy to give up shared power if you're benefiting from it. So we need to show that there's actually more to be benefited from by everyone if we include everyone. So that would be my very short answer. Hopefully, I hope I answered the question.
No, definitely. I think that was really helpful. And I want to kind of draw in Faizat into this conversation, especially given her, perspective around the cultures that persist. I don't know, Faizat, if you've got an intervention here for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had my hand up a little earlier. I just wanted to, to maybe encourage Dominique that feminist movements have been having a lot of conversations about the AU CVOG, and it'll be really interesting to have the Parliament also kind of listening to what we're saying and how we can strengthen it better before the ratification. The second thing I wanted to add to the conversation now that you just on the questions about the implementation, I'll speak from two angles. The first angle being just building up on what Theophilus just said. There are laws, there are policies coming into place, and then of course implementation is always a gap with these laws. One of the critical ways that we can do this is also always making sure, Nigeria, we say, put money where the mouth is. So when we create laws, we're making sure that it's backed by budgets. So when we have, for example, we're adopting CEDAW, we are creating new laws that has to do with women's financial control, we make sure that there is money for the implementation. And then secondly, there is also an implementation plan. So sometimes our advocacy and our work usually stops at, oh, we're advocating for the passage of this law, and then the law is passed and then it stopped. There's no monitoring, there's no accountability, there is no follow through and follow up. But again, given the context where we're working, where sometimes the law is actually non-existent, our what's it called? Our work now kind of focuses on the community itself, because the truth is also that we can have all these laws and policy in place. If community attitudes do not shift and perceptions do not shift, just by from what your data is telling us, then none of it would. We can have a fantastic law that says it's going to imprison anybody that does this. But for let me give you a very clear example. Which country was it I was looking at recently, where we are advocating? In Uganda, the law clearly criminalizes sexual violence, but it sets an option of fine for 40,000 UGX. That's because the law was created years and years ago. 40,000 UGX is about, let's say, less than $100. It's not even up to maybe 20 or something dollars. So somebody can say, oh, I'll beat my wife, I'm fine with paying the $20. You know, it's not a lot of money. So sometimes we need to continue that monitoring, making sure that we're following and there's accountability and follow-up. And then the second that I was talking about is, you know, community mindset and shifting narratives. I've seen a lot of comments in they're talking about engaging men and boys. I think that's a very good strategy, ensuring that also they do not occupy the space, but engaging them as allies in the process. Engaging with traditional and religious leaders, also very critical and important from our work. We've seen the importance of that. A very quick example for me to wrap up is that, for example, we support girls in engaging in non-traditional classes because we want to break gender stereotypes. So when we're supporting girls in countries like South Sudan and Somalia, we enroll them in courses such as engineering, electrical, you know, IT, which is very not normal in these countries. But what we also do before we enroll the girls is have a conversation and dialogue with the parents, because we know that they do carry a lot of weight in determining whether or not the girls can stay in school or not. So I'll pause here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faizat. I think you know, one of the things you've touched on is the accountability aspect of it all, right? There has to be money in place for the law and the policy to be implemented, but also there's also the fact of, you know, what other conditions are there. I think one of the results that Josephine raised is who is involved in your decision making around money. And so when you spoke about education, I think that also really touched on that, like who else is involved in the education of this, you know, this young girl, and should we also, you know, we must also speak to them because they're part of that ecosystem. Now, a very, very important point. They always say the conversation gets delicious towards the end of our webinar. And so our last question that I think will be a takeaway from all of our speakers today is by Fonka Muta Bo Bernard, who says, Cameroon just came out of an election with a single female candidate in which the biggest lobby for female representation in politics, more women in politics, failed to back her candidacy. Considering women are 60% plus of the population, isn't it contradictory that they are underrepresented at decision-making tables? Goodness. Fonka really came here with a nice, delicious finish to our webinar. Perhaps we can start off from Dominique, Nozipo, Theophilin, and then Faizat.
Nozipo, do you want to start? That one is a tricky question.
Well, yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think this is really a big struggle, and it's also being influenced by current contemporary politics, geopolitics that we are having, and we should not forget that. In my closing remarks, I would just like to say, one does observe the sort of increase of Christian Zionism in the world, but also in our continent. We're experiencing a lot more technology-assisted gender-based violence and all other activities. You know, those of us who have grandchildren who are in their teens and children who are growing up and are, you know, the children of our friends and so on, and this addiction to the internet and social media, I think we should not underestimate the impact that also is having on the erosion of all the gains that I think women and men have made over the years. And lastly, the militarization and the wars that we're seeing happening now, you know, where these 150 girls were just killed like that, and the genocide in Gaza. I think these contemporary issues are really affecting, first of all, just the psychology of people right now. And I think we need to integrate them in the discussions we have so that we don't lose sight of what's happening at a global level and how that's impacting at a local level. And lastly, Amina and I once had a boss called Tumen Ntleko, because I used to work for MTN as well, and he's just written a book reminding us that by 2050, there'll be 1 in every 4 people in this world will be African. And so we have that huge sort of youth dividend, that bulge that's happening. And the challenge is, you know, how are we going to prepare our young people to take over and make a future for themselves, which does take into considerations women's rights and gender equality, and use the Ubuntu that we all have as Africans. You know, what are the strengths? How can we also play a role in influencing the rest of the world and not be marginal to what's happening? And that includes women and men, and men by far over, you know, there are more women than men in the world generally in global, but also continental demographics. So I'll just end it there. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nozipho, for grounding us within the geopolitics of it all. I think it's quite easy to forget that we are not, as much as Africa is a big continent, we are not on an island. Then Dominique, perhaps you want to take over from Nozipho?
Yes. So to complement Nozipho's comments, I would say that as much as we were talking about educating the boy child, I believe there's also an educational work around, should I call it female solidarity? Because to change, we can't change the narrative it's something that will take time, decades, generations, but by starting today, you know, to be, because the question was talking about women that failed to back candidacy of another woman who could have been carrying their grievances forward. There's also, I believe, a cultural dimension here that needs to be reshaped, redefined, so that women feel bold enough to have, you know, to have many more candidates, so that they feel, because as we mentioned throughout the discussions, it's no more a matter of competencies, but just of taking the step and standing for our grounds, if not for ourselves, maybe for the generations to come. Nozipho was talking about the young generation. If maybe we feel at our level things are a bit late, we still can modify it for generations. So I believe we need to start. We need to start now, and conversations like this one, for which I commend Afrobarometer's work, are really important. Someone mentioned at the beginning of the discussion that we needed more conversations like this, so that at various aspects of the gender issues, we can merge, you know, and come up with solutions informed by data, by real evidence-based data, to make sure that one, we hold our leadership accountable with accurate information. We make sure things are implemented. And I also really like because it's something that comes back regularly, the FISAT's comment on laws backed by budget, because being in the field, it's true that it's something that really comes regularly as a hurdle. You would have this enthusiasm after the adoption of a law. You would want to rush in the field to popularize, promote, make sure grassroots people are aware of this new tool they can use for themselves on a daily basis, and you face this hurdle of budget. And yeah, I think I'll pause there for now. These are questions that can make us discuss throughout the day and even lose sight of the initial question, but I'll pause there for now. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominique. Okay, so we'll have Theophilus and Faisal to close us off.
Okay, and I'll try to keep it short. So I saw that question before you actually picked it for us to answer, and I think the situation actually reflects how power is structured rather than proportion, or rather than numbers, right? In terms of the size of the population and the proportion that is women, right? Because representation is really not just about the numbers, it's about like access to resources, networks, and the institutions that shape decision making. And unfortunately, those systems, those institutions, they have been historically structured in ways that disadvantage women. So it also highlights something that we haven't mentioned yet, which is that women are not a homogeneous group, right? So political alignment, ideology, incentives, they do matter, just as they do for men as well. And from a broader perspective, we are quite interested in these kinds of, it's a very tricky issue in the sense that it requires changing the underlying rules of the game, right? It's how do we structure political financing? How do parties select candidates? How are leadership pipelines built, right? If there's no woman in the pipeline, then it becomes a long game, for instance. So I think that this issue is more about how power and opportunity are distributed in the society, and how we need to think about how to shift that and really move the needle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Theophilus. Really appreciate that. I mean, again, towards the end of webinars, people really raise these points that just require more conversation. My goodness. Faizat?
Thank you, Tendo. And I think what I would do is just take us back to what brought us here, which is the research from the research that Afrobarometer has to respond to that question. So I actually went back and looked at the findings, and particularly to the question for Cameroon. I saw that Cameroon, 44% believe that women shouldn't have paid employment or be employed by the family. I saw that 28% of women, or girls rather, are prevented from going to school. I also saw that 73% feel like men make better political leaders. And I feel like that's where we have our answer. So yes, there's 60% people, women in the community, but the social norms and the perception has not changed. They still think that men are better political leaders. They think that, 27% feels like if, same chances are being elected. So the data is telling us clearly where the problem is and how we need to address the problem. We need to go, but there are laws, there are policies. Women now have the chance. There was the caucus, but what is still the problem? The problem is still that the society thinks that men should own such leadership position. So how do we counter that? Narrative shifts, power shifts, like Theophilus said, and then social norms. We have to continue to engage and change the perspective. And I think Nofiso said earlier, it doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual as well. So we have to keep trying and keep pushing the button. And then somebody also talked about representation beyond numbers. Yes, we push for 35% quotas, we push for 30% or 35% quotas, but we also push for meaningful representation. An example clearly is from Somalia, where they have the 30% quota, but then the clan gets to select who. So they identify somebody who they know would not speak at all once they put them in the assembly. So, we also have to just be very crafty in how we're pushing for the agenda that we're pushing for. I'll pause here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all the lovely speakers and also to the audience's participation. I think you really all made, of course, in the language of gender equality, the participation and the contributions here as meaningful as they could possibly be. And I just want to encourage everybody to take away these insights, and as well as the research from Afrobarometer, which really is a mirror of society and where society's norms are, and to apply it to everyday work, as Nozipo mentioned, in every level and at every structure, to make sure that people put their what did you call it? The money where the mouth is, or the mouth where the money is. But together, those things make it work. But I just want to thank all of you, to my lovely speakers, and also to GIZ, Economists for Transformation, as well as Afrobarometer, for bringing us all here today to have these lovely, lovely discussions. Of course, the research is going to be, the links to the research are going to be shared. Please follow the LinkedIn pages for E4T as well, for a lovely, insightful remarks. And with that, I will just close off with reminders from our speakers. We need to shift social norms and perceptions. Laws need to be backed by budgets, and the organization mobilization around women that leverages their agency is very critical. And the battle that we are fighting currently is a mindset shift, particularly around female solidarity. I think those are some of the most useful takeaways that we can have today. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to hosting you again, and to having more wonderful conversations. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Afrobarometer, and our chairperson, Amina. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.